I welcome the fact that there's legislation, but I think it is beyond urgent, because I actually don't accept IBEC's contention that this issue can be addressed by increased inspections or better enforcement alone. It is a huge problem. I was in the WRC on Monday in one of these cases. I won't mention the company, but it's obvious they're going to lose, and lose badly, and I think they realise that. But when they lose, they're going to appeal to the Labour Court, and when they lose that, it's going to go to the High Court. And the vulnerable non-national worker who had the courage to take this case, having previously gone to the Department of Social Protection and Revenue telling them there was nothing wrong with his status, Social Protection about a year and a half later eventually siding with him, will probably be well outside the country by that time. So our present structure is inadequate. There are problems with the WRC, and I would draw the Minister's attention to the article in Village magazine by George McLaughlin, who formerly worked for the WRC and made a protected disclosure about the problems there and the systemic favouritism to employers in the WRC, which is a problem. So a standalone investigations unit is necessary. A beefed-up legislation allowing groups the implications of one case expand to others is absolutely necessary. But if the Minister could clarify, is she saying this legislation is going to come on board in a couple of months or a couple of weeks?
The next who's tabled is Deputy Joan Collins. 1 minute.
Thank you. I was at the meeting last week with IBEC, and the attitude they had was quite astounding, because it is a case that, while we haven't seen definite figures that people coming forward in that survey that was requested, we know it's happening throughout industry. We know it's happening with journalists, we know it's happening with English language teachers, pilots, construction industry, couriers. I got an email from a young woman, a person that's been caught up in bogus contracts in the tourism industry as tour director since 2005. She's had to take a case to the court, to Scope, and won it. And it's on the record. On March 7, 2019, the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection decided, on foot of a scope investigation, that I'm an employee of CIE Tours, insurable under the Social Welfare Acts at PRSI Class A, and CIE are now appealing that decision. So it is rampant. It's going across industry now at this stage, and there's an urgent need for legislation to be brought in relation to this. And I welcome the fact that you're talking about it, but there are 4 bills in there at the moment that we think could be used as a comprehensive piece of legislation with yourself to be able to bring forward a robust one.
Next to table the question, Deputy Willie O'Dea.
There are two issues have been raised. First of all, the question of how big a problem is it, and whether the numbers are growing or stable or decreasing or whatever. I could argue with your contention about the numbers, Minister, and Deputy Smith has adverted to that. It is a significant problem. It is quite a significant problem at the moment, and in my view it's growing. And if anything, the evolution of the gig economy is only going to facilitate the problem getting greater unless we tackle it now. Then you raised the question of legislation. I think that you did announce there, and you repeated your announcement in the Shannon, that you're going to bring in your own legislation. Now, we spent a long time in this House being told by yourself and other members of the government that legislation wasn't necessary in this area, that the present system will work. Now, I think by offering to bring in legislation, you're now acknowledging that the present system is not sufficient. Now, so the question then relates to when are we going to get the new legislation to tackle a problem that you acknowledge now exists. Now, there are a number of bills prepared, one of them by myself, others by the Labour Party, the Deputy Smith's party, etc. And we can coordinate our approach. We can decide amongst ourselves and to put forward one of those bills with the appropriate amendments. And I think it would be far better if the government accepted that now, rather than setting up another team to investigate further and expressing the hope that sometime in the ill-defined future that they may be able to sort of introduce their own legislation. I think that would be a better approach if the government is seriously committed to solving this problem, because, as Deputy Daly says, and I agree with her, it's beyond time for a solution.
And now Deputy John Brady is also tabled.
Well, to hear the Minister, I suppose, put forward arguments from employers that these are genuine errors in terms of classifying someone as self-employed. It rings the same bells as IBEC that were before the committee last week, when they said they do not believe that any legislation is necessary. So the fact that the Minister is looking at bringing forward legislation has to be welcomed, but it also shows that herself and her department realise the scale, the massive scale of bogus self-employment that is out there in existence and growing. And some of the evidence that was given to us show by Congress, for example, that in the construction sector alone, there is an estimated loss of €240 million a year in terms of employer PRSI and indeed tax. And that doesn't even touch on the loss of rights and employment rights. And also, and I've said this a number of times, even in this House, and I'm sure some of the camera operators filming proceedings here this morning, they are engaged in a number of scope exercises with the department. So bogus self-employment is in here, in this House, by camera people operating the cameras in here. So it's massive, it's huge. Now, there are a number of bills. My own party has a bill that we've brought forward as well. So there's 4 bills here, Minister. Please. So I welcome the fact that you've brought forward legislation. It is evidence that something needs to be done here, clearly. So I'd encourage you to sit down with all of us here, have a look at all the bills and bring forward the most robust legislation.
When I remind people of the 1-minute rule, everybody agree with it, but they don't implement it. As there's other questions, I can give a short question to you. Yeah, well, listen, we'll get this is the last question on this one. Just a short one, though. But
yeah, Minister, just to make you aware of a situation in relation to a person who is trying to gain, whether it's direct employment or indirect employment, that I have come across an Irish person with an Irish birth certificate and an Irish passport who has returned home from the United States, having lived in the United States for 46 years, is being denied a PPS number. So they can't get any form of employment at the moment. They need a PPS number to apply for a driver's licence, for housing, for a passport. And this has been presented to me that a person has to have a valid reason for a PPSN, and they're being denied by your department.
It's a different question.
I just want to make you aware of this. I know it's in the context of employment that they might be applying for also. And I just want to wonder if I can send you the details. Can you look at it post-haste?
Minister, to answer the substantive. Minister.
First of all, Deputy Collins, just if you give me the details before you go, there's absolutely nobody should be denied a PPSN number, and I'll take care of that today. I'm actually glad that we all can agree. What I don't subscribe to is the view that certain members of this House would think that I favour one set of organisations over another. I sit at monthly meetings with both our social partners that represent our union colleagues and our social partners that represent our business colleagues. And on most occasions they have diametrically opposed views. And my job is to sift through the views and decide where the reality sometimes lands. And so there's one half of the social partners would tell me that this problem is absolutely enormous, and as Deputy Brady has said, would cite hundreds of millions of euros that are being lost. The other side would tell me that there's absolutely no problem and carry on as we always have done. And with regard to the statement that you just made, Deputy O'Dea, that I have finally come around to the view that there's a problem here. For as long as I've sat in this chair, and it's nearly 2 years now, I've always acknowledged that there's been a problem. I've always prefaced my remarks that I don't know what the size of the problem is. Deputy, I have the chair now, if you don't mind, with the floor. I've always said I don't know what the size of the problem is, but that if it's only 10 people or 10,000 people, the legislation needs to be robust to protect those 10 people, or indeed those 10,000 people or 100,000 people, whatever the size of the problem is. The legislation that we have a requirement to put on our statute books to protect, even if it's only one person, needs to be looked at. And that's why I'm bringing forward government's legislation, because that's my job. Now, I'm quite happy to look at all your legislation, but as I've said to you, it's not my job to process or to progress Solidarity PVP's legislation, nor is it my job to progress your legislation. If anybody wants to bring forward their legislation or have a sit around the table conversation with us to see how we can progress and solve this problem, I'm very happy to do so. But I've told you, and I made a statement last week, I now have done a considerable amount of work arising from your amendment that went into the Social Welfare Bill last year that then you subsequently removed, thankfully, to do and present what I presented in the last week. And so I'm going to keep moving forward to change the practices, to increase the training within my own department, to potentially look, Deputy Daly, at a standalone issue, because I have the same reservations that you have. Now, I don't have the authority over the WRC, and I certainly can't subscribe to the views that you have with regard to them. But what I know is that when people bring their complaints to us, and they aren't anything like the numbers that would be reflected by the people in this House, and that genuinely worries me because there's a divergence of reality there. When people bring their claims They are entitled to due process, and both sides are entitled to make their claim as to whether they are self-employed or whether the employer thinks that they're self-employed or not self-employed. And the adjudication process is robust. Somebody is entitled to a decision, they're entitled to appeal that decision, whatever side of the decision that they're on. And if neither side like the decision that comes from my department, then they are entitled to bring it to the Labour Court, the High Court or the Supreme Court. That's the law of this land. The legislation, the gaps in the legislation that currently exists, that I'm going to bring forward in the next couple of weeks, will make the inspections more robust. They will make the decisions that are made more geographically consistent or industry-specific consistent, because it shouldn't make any difference whether you work in a construction site or a hairdresser's. The decision should be the same. The determining factor is whether the definition of employment applies to you or self-employment doesn't apply to you. It is as simple as that, and we don't need to make it any more robust. But we need to ensure that when we do catch people, that they are fined and that the penalties are enough to procure.
Deputy Richard Barrett to present.